Hello, and welcome to my first attempt at making a sort of documentary. In this video, I'll be looking at the architectural style of Bristol Byzantine. The Bristol part is simple enough. This is a style which developed here in the English city of Bristol, and as far as I know remained limited to Bristol, although this is perhaps a bit of a circular argument by definition. The Byzantine part is less straightforward. Even the issue of how to say it is difficult. The internet tells me that British people say Byzantine, and Americans say Byzantine, but there's also the potential for Byzantine or Byzantine, and whichever way I choose is sure to annoy a large proportion of listeners who will think I'm wrong. Byzantine rolls off the tongue better for me though, I think because of the assonance with Bristol, so that's what I'll roll with. As for what it means, on paper it's a subgenre of Byzantine revival architecture, named after Byzantine architecture, named after the Byzantine Empire, named after Byzantium, aka Constantinople, aka Istanbul. Ergo, you might think Bristol Byzantine basically means 19th century Bristolians' attempts at looking kind of old school Turkish, right? However, if you look at some of these examples and fail to detect much Turkish or Eastern Orthodox flavour, instead seeing echoes of Moorish architecture more akin to something you'd find in Spain, well, you're not alone. Byzantine, it seems, is a term used rather liberally here, almost like a sort of catch-all term for anything vaguely exotic or Mediterranean. Anyway, in this video I will attempt to investigate some of these influences and explore the context which saw this rather improbable style emerge in this one particular city and time. Today, the floating harbour is largely focused around residential and leisure uses, and the usually easy explanation is that the advent of containerised shipping rendered these docks almost entirely obsolete. Modern megaships can't weave their way up the Avon Gorge and through these locks to come into the city, so a new container port was built out at Avonmouth and the working port regenerated into the mixed-use vibe it has today. But in truth, Bristol's docks problems started far, far before containerisation. For most of the medieval period it was the second biggest port in the country after London, and even as late as the 18th century it was the third biggest English city in terms of tax receipts. This status had created a lot of wealth, much of which went into building a fine Georgian cityscape, like Clifton up here. It should always be noted that much of this wealth came from the triangular trade, or less euphemistically, the Atlantic slave trade. Ships would sail from Bristol to West Africa, load up on slaves, cross the Atlantic, exchange the slaves for slave labour-produced commodities such as sugar, and return home. Altogether, around 2,000 Bristol slave ships carried an estimated 500,000 people from Africa to slavery in the Americas, which from today's perspective is obviously abhorrent. But at the time, the Slave Trade Act of 1807 and Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 would have appeared to many Bristolian merchants as a problem, not as any cause for celebration or a step in the right direction. Furthermore, the Industrial Revolution had fueled the enormous growth of Liverpool, a rival West Coast port with bigger, newer facilities, and located in much more convenient proximity to the mills and factories responsible for the bulk of the industrial era's imports and exports. So by the early 1800s, the port of Bristol needed to reinvent itself to keep up, in a very literal and drastic sense. The floating harbour itself is something of a desperate and ultimately failed attempt to do so. The project fully deserves its own video, but to cut a long story short, they built these huge locks to keep the harbour full of water at all times, even allowing for the enormous tidal range of the Avon, up to 9 metres, and dug a bypass channel called the New Cut to replace the tidal flow of the river. This engineering mega-project cost the equivalent of roughly £50 million in today's money, so having gone to all that trouble, they were obviously going to spruce up the harbourside facilities while they were at it, right? And if there's one thing the Victorians were famous for, it's zealously constructing ambitious new buildings and infrastructure to keep pace with their freshly industrialised, rapidly urbanising world. Which is where we meet Bristol Byzantine, because unlike most highly ornate, decorative examples of Victorian architecture, including well-known landmarks like St Pancras or even the Houses of Parliament, this is not a style which was primarily unleashed for grand public buildings, town halls, churches and the like. Rather, it was most used in industrial buildings, warehouses and factories. Now, it might seem surprising that people would lavish this degree of intricacy on warehouses, because you might imagine that even back then, Those would have been built with a rather more functional, value-orientated mindset. But it's not like one day they just set out building things as extravagantly decorated as this granary out of nowhere. The style evolved gradually over a period of many decades. One of the earliest examples cited as Bristol Byzantine is Bush House, now known as the Arnolfini Art Gallery. It's usually dated to the 1830s and described as a tea warehouse, although if you dig into the records a bit more, it turns out to have stored a far more diverse array of things than just tea. Anyway, as you can see, it's considerably more plain than the granary, and in fact, I didn't even mentally group it under the same architectural umbrella as the more strikingly polychromatic brick examples until after I'd started researching this stuff online. To my untrained eye, it seemed like a completely different style, but in fact, you can trace a lineage. It was built by an architect called Richard Shackleton Pope, and it's worth comparing it to a building that he had recently completed in 1830, the Wool Hall, which is now a pub and live music venue called the Fleece. As the name suggests, this was literally a hall for trading and processing wool. The countryside around Bristol is very much sheep territory. Here, for example, are some that I met near Dundry, which is barely a mile south of the city. So this was an important part of the economy in medieval times, with sheep being driven right into the city centre to go to market. But after the sheer volume of sheep began to clog up Bristol Bridge, Pope was commissioned to build this new venue on St Thomas Street in Redcliffe. This isn't a Byzantine building, but it is an important ancestor in the evolution of the style, inasmuch as one architecture writer described it as the first quasi-industrial building in Bristol to attempt a real architectural facade. The style attempted, according to the Heritage England listing, is classical. And sure, you can see a sort of attempt at a triangular pediment up there. You've got semicircular arches on those windows, which is all very Romanesque, and it's all very symmetrical. So yeah, you can see classical aspects here, but personally, when I look at it, it doesn't really scream classical to me, and I think the reason for this is the materials. Now, it may be very inaccurate of me, historically speaking, but I personally tend to associate classical, or perhaps I should say neoclassical and Palladian architecture, with smooth white marble or Portland stone perhaps, whereas the stonework on this building is so rugged, it really gives it a quite vernacular flavour to my eyes. Obviously this is most apparent on the rubble-faced floors, but even the relatively finely worked masonry on the ground floor has a somewhat chunky, unfinessed quality about it. The rubble is a stone called pennant stone, which is quarried quite locally, and the style in which it's used is also quite local to my eyes. It reminds me of the kind of rubble cottages you get in the local countryside. Here's Pensford, for example, which is a few miles south of Bristol. And I think this serves to make this building feel very local. And given that Bristol and Somerset is clearly not Rome or Athens, that in turn makes it feel inherently less purely classical to me. So while there isn't anything here yet to mark this out as particularly Byzantine, there is at least the roots of a distinctly Bristol-born style emerging here. Coming back to Bush House, completed just a few years later, we can see Pope reusing much of the same material palette and stylistic devices, this time with perhaps a bit more finesse. Once again, we've got a ground floor with a different finish to all the upper stories. We've got this rubble-hewn pennant stone, we've got semicircular arches up there, but it does have a slightly different vibe to the Wool Hall. I'd be hard-pushed to call this one particularly Eastern-looking either, but we should remember that the Byzantine Empire would initially have simply considered themselves the Roman Empire. As such, early Byzantine architecture is essentially indistinguishable from Roman architecture, so if this looks kind of classical, then I guess it's not strictly incorrect to say it's also kind of Byzantine too, even if there's nothing outstandingly Eastern about it. One feature that's worth drawing attention to is these horizontal bands of lighter, smoother stone. This is Bath stone, a type of limestone so named because it was famously used to create almost the entire city of Bath, which is about 11 miles southwest of Bristol. So obviously it's another very local stone, and it's also a very beautiful stone. So it's fascinating to me that it actually doesn't dominate Bristol's architectural materiality in the same way that it dominates Bath. Don't get me wrong, there's certainly a lot of lovely Bath stone buildings here, particularly up in areas like Clifton, but I never really feel like it's the default texture of the city. Bristol tends to use it as the icing on the cake and not as the cake itself. And that's reflected in this building, where the Bath stone is only used for the detailing and a more rugged, presumably cheaper sandstone is used for the rest of the building. The architectural Pevsner guide gushes over this building's stately proportions, its scale and the almost Grecian purity of the detailing. Its dignified bearing transcends its industrial origins. And far be it for me to argue with people who actually know what they're talking about. But while I do agree it has nice scale and proportions, I'm not actually the biggest fan of this one. Partly this is due to the rather dubious modern roofline, but even looking at the original features, I find the mix of semicircular arched and rectangular windows to be a bit unsatisfying, and the uppermost floor looks almost comically squished. On the other hand, I do quite like these subtle recesses used to group these windows, introducing a verticality to offset the horizontal bands of limestone. We'll see more of this type of thing in future buildings. By the way, if the modern renovations of this building distress you, you might want to stop watching this video now, because basically 0 Bristol Byzantine buildings have made it to the present day unscathed. This isn't really surprising, considering they were mostly built as warehouses and the like, and as we've already seen, the floating harbour is no longer a working cargo port, so they were always going to be repurposed, at best. The luckier buildings have been converted to offices or apartments or art galleries, in a way which leaves their exteriors intact. Others have been somewhat mutilated, if that's not too dramatic a word, by inappropriate interventions and facadism. Still others are near derelict, and many more have been demolished altogether. And fast forwarding a couple of decades from Bush House to the 1850s and the General Hospital, we duly find another one which has undergone its fair share of extensions, alterations and transformations over the years, although in this case they have thankfully been quite sympathetic ones. The original building was designed by William Bruce Gingell, a possibly Scottish-born but definitely Bristol-based architect whose name will reappear repeatedly in this video. You'll see we have the same formula of rubble with bar stone trimmings, but the amount of flair has inched up ever so slightly. It's a darker, bluer pennant stone, providing a more defined, high-contrast, bicolour effect, something which would become key to the Bristol Byzantine style. Semicircular arches are present and correct, in particularly charming form, I think, but with the tower of the building, Gingell began to push the stylistic envelope. Unfortunately, this dome you see today is a reconstruction, the original having been destroyed by bombing in World War II. But even back in the 1850s, this tower was topped by a distinctive ogee dome. Ogee, I discovered during my research, is a term meaning a double curve or S-shaped curve, and these immediately start to introduce a slightly more exotic touch to our previously somewhat austere Romanesque flavour. Of course, the General is still a long way from the degree of ornamentation to come in later Bristol Byzantine. But over in the city centre, Gingell was already illustrating how decorative and twiddly he could get. His 1854 build for a local bank, in conjunction with another Bristol architect by the name of T.R. Lysart, is almost overwhelmingly decorated with sculpture and architectural detail. This was supposedly modelled on St Mark's Library in Venice, and the influence of Venetian architecture would be an important ingredient in the Bristol Byzantine mix, adding a sort of second-hand exoticism, given the Adriatic city-state's ties across the eastern Mediterranean. But this particular example seems to come down very much more on the Italianate side of things. It's very Western to my eyes. As we enter the 1860s, though, we begin to get a clearer dose of exotic flavour. Edward William Godwin's 1862 Carriage Works takes the bicolour effect we've seen previously and combines it with the semicircular arches we've also seen previously in a very specific way. The arches are strung together into a continuous arcade, and each arch very specifically alternates between the pennant and Bath stones, resulting in a distinctive pattern. Although this pattern can be found on Byzantine buildings, to me it prompted a rather different association, La Mezquita, or the Great Mosque Cathedral of Cordova. Admittedly, this specific comparison is probably not one an academic architectural historian would jump to. I probably did so simply because it's the only significant Moorish building I've been to, and also one of my favourite buildings that I've ever been to. Still, you can see why I'd associate this style of arch more strongly with Moorish architecture than anything else, right? Which rather puzzled me, because Cordova is in modern-day Andalusia, Spain, which, in the 8th century, when this was built, was very much not part of the Byzantine Empire. So I spent the first period of my research worrying what to do about the fact that many of these so-called Bristol Byzantine buildings didn't look particularly Byzantine, or even particularly like each other. After all, the term had been invented by John Summerson, who Wikipedia describes as one of the leading architectural historians of the 20th century, so as an uneducated nobody I could hardly disagree with it. I was therefore somewhat relieved when my Pevsner guide turned up and found that it complains that the category is ill-defined and the nomenclature is vexing, for there are various models for the buildings, none of them especially Byzantine. Phew, not just me then. Anyway, back to the carriage works, which unfortunately are now naught but this facade. The battle for what to do with the decaying building was a long and complex one, involving the usual suspects of the planning authorities, property developers, local residents, general public, campaign groups, and I could not begin to cover it in this video. Suffice to say that behind all this scaffolding we've got some apartments going up which will have the carriage works facade as a kind of death mask. Moorish flavoured arches seem to quickly become fashionable. In 1863 we see possibly T.R. Lysart using this same sort of style in this Clark's Wood Company warehouse, and in 1865 we see his Lloyds bank collaborator William Bruce Gingell getting in on the alternating colour action, albeit rather weakly, with this brewery building. And for those of you who are keeping track of these things, yep, this is another one that's been kind of violated. But anyway, just around the corner, or today, ducking through this underpass under this lamentably divisive urban nearly motorway, in the same year, Gingell was starting to take things to another level with this warehouse for the Christopher Thomas and Brothers Soap Company. With the introduction of red brick alongside the honey-coloured bathstone and grey pennant, we're now playing with three colours, and starting to turn the corner from a relatively po-faced classical approach to decoration and into something more exuberant. Turning the corner in a slightly more literal sense, at the same time, the same company built some offices in pretty much the same style, but with different architects. The former Gardener's offices, formerly the Christopher Thomas and Brothers Soap Company offices, are attributed to Foster and Wood. These two were once again Bristolian architects, in fact one of the preeminent local firms of the period. Those of you on Heritage Watch will be dismayed to see the 2007 photo on Wikipedia showing two of the arches replaced by a steel beam to create a wider entrance. But back in the present day you can see the building has been renovated since then, and thankfully the arches have been restored in the process. The thing to note about both these buildings is that they exhibit constructional polychromy, to use the rather unwieldy phrase of influential Victorian art critic John Ruskin. At its most basic, this means that the colour is not just superficial. You can't wash off coloured paint or remove colourful tiles and be left with a building which is not colourful but still equally functional. If you removed all the colourful elements of these buildings, they would fall down because the colour is inherent to the structural elements. Taking the concept a little further, we can see that the different colours closely correlate to different structural forms and purposes. For example, here the arches are red and the non-arches are grey. Here, likewise, red for arches, yellow limestone for the window frames and the cornice, grey for the general stone of the wall. This isn't a strictly one-to-one correspondence. That is, arches means red, but red doesn't necessarily mean arches, as you can see, for example, some horizontal bands of red here. Still, to me, this does feel a bit like a early form of structural expressionism, about a century before anybody invented the term. The other decorative feature I want to draw attention to is somewhat similar in being part of the structure and not just glued on top of it. Check out this row of bricks arranged at 45 degrees to create a zigzag effect. There's something similar around the arches too. I really love this effect. As soon as you add sunlight and shadow into the equation, you get a decorative effect that constantly changes, nearly invisible in some lights and striking sawtooth patterns at other times. But it's arguably Foster & Wood's 1867 Colston Hall which really launches these emerging motifs into a new world of possibilities. At which point, another brief and unfortunate interlude. Yes, Colston Hall as in that Colston, the slave-trading Colston, who used to be memorialised on a statue on this plinth, with its rather inaccurate caption, until July 2020 during Black Lives Matter-inspired protests, when it was torn down and launched into the harbour, an image of which hit the headlines around the world. The music venue has since renamed itself to the Bristol Beacon to distance itself from this controversy, but since I'm speaking in a historic context, referring to it by that name seems very anachronistic, so I will refer to it as the Colston Hall, but I assure you that no endorsement of slave traders is implied. I think the Colston Hall is a pivotal building in this story, which makes it all the more unfortunate that I can't film it properly, because as you can see it's currently undergoing renovations. These have reportedly found the remaining Victorian parts of the building to be in very poor condition. I say remaining parts because the place has been gutted by fire twice and extended with this, which certainly plumps for the bold juxtaposition approach to extending historic buildings in favour of mimicry or pastiche, which is something I generally approve of for what it's worth. At this point, my first draft script said something like, "The obvious innovation here is the use of yellow brick," except the use of yellow brick is not at all obvious unless you really squint behind that scaffolding. So I'm particularly indebted in this section to photographers for making their shots of this facade available under permissive Creative Commons licenses. Anyway, firstly, I think this building is important because it shows the style jumping from industrial to civic use. To take a style developed on warehouses and factories and now apply it to a major new city centre concert hall seems like a sort of coming of age. Secondly, we're seeing a turning point in the dominant material and the resultant aesthetic. Architects Foster & Wood dispensed with the Bath stone and pennant rubble in favour of bright yellow and red bricks. The adoption of brick didn't necessarily mean abandoning local materials per se. Much of the brick we'll see in this video came from Cattybrook pits, which is only about 7 miles north of here. What it did mean on a purely visual level was an unlocking of a more diverse, brighter, higher contrast palette which, compared to the chunky rubble pennant, could be arranged into crisper patterns made from a tighter grid. If architects were drawing pixel art before with their masonry blocks of stone, it's like they've just moved from 4 or 8-bit to 16-bit sprites. The possibilities for decorative constructional polychromy had exploded, although in fairness the Colston Hall did not exactly push the boundaries of these possibilities itself. While we do see some beautiful brickwork, including the use of these zigzagging, diagonally laid ones again, the use of colour is decidedly restrained. Instead, much of the decoration is non-structural, sculptural, drawn from the same sort of well of inspiration as the Lloyds Bank we saw earlier. But by building Bristol Byzantine in brick, Foster & Wood were opening a gate to connect this local style with a broader design trend flourishing across the country. Polychromatic brick was by now a well-established design trend in Victorian England, popularised by critics like the aforementioned John Ruskin and architects like William Butterfield and his All Saints Margaret Street. It had been and would continue to be a popular choice in Gothic revival generally, including icons such as the aforementioned St Pancras Hotel. In Bristol, however, this decoratively multicoloured brickwork would be combined with the previously somewhat subtle Byzantine, Venetian and Moorish influences to create some unique and remarkably extravagant buildings, arguably none more so than this, the Granary. If that isn't one of the most ornately decorative industrial buildings you've ever seen, then please do tell me in the comments where you live so I can come there and film your warehouses. It almost feels pointless talking about this, as the images surely speak for themselves, but I feel duty bound to make a token effort of narration, so observe how we now have 3 vivid colours to choose from, with red, yellow and black. We still have our classically semicircular arches in our typically two-tone Moorish colour alternations, but these have been joined by a whole stack of variations in new styles. On the ground floor we have these pointy arches stylised with OG curves inlaid in the brickwork above. Above this, and above all, we have this fantastically complex perforation that blurs the lines between fenestration and ventilation. Granaries do need to maintain a flow of fresh air, so this is partly functional, but function alone wouldn't dictate such ornate, playful visuals. We've consistently seen buildings with a different ground floor treatment since the very roots of the style, and we've seen this developed with even more tiers of styles. But in this instance we have literally every single floor receiving a completely unique treatment. We've got these so-called normal arches, then these star-shaped holes with flat-topped windows above, then we've got circles embedded within our arches, these cross-type holes, then 2 smaller arches set within our previously sized arches, then we've got more rows of zigzag bricks, we've got arches with twin columns and a row of zigzag bricks around the arch. The level of variation is insane, and yet the whole elevation still manages to hang together cohesively enough at a glance. At the top, we've got turrets along the roofline, and at the bottom, I am obliged to point out, despite its complete irrelevance to the Byzantine theme, we have the cellar bar where Del Boy fell through the gap in the bar. Just around the corner, at 35 King Street, we find a cork warehouse from circa 1870. The listing suggesting that it's possibly by Henry Masters or William Bruce Gingell. If I may stick my neck out, I'd say more likely the former, given that many of his other buildings displayed strong Venetian flavours quite akin to this one, whereas hardly anything else by William Bruce Gingell reminds me of this at all. Here again we have a feast of beautiful detailing. At the top we have a highly sculptural cornice, and the top row of semicircular arches have these decorative eyebrows pinched into a point, all arranged in a somewhat musical 2-2-3-2-2 grouping. Below, the pointed arches' eyebrows have been stylised so far as to become all point, no arch, and between there and the ground we have these slender vertical columns and window groupings which create a sense of loftiness far beyond this building's actually rather modest height. We're back to only 2 colours, with red brick and yellow limestone, but with detailing this superbly balanced, that's enough, and for those who are missing the pennant rubble, well, it's been relegated from the fancy facade, but it's still there round the side. It's probably about time I addressed the question that I alluded to in the intro. Why on earth would people decide to build their warehouses in such ornate and exotic styles? I found one essay online which confidently states, from the outset, it was a statement of intent about Victorian Bristol's ambitions and versatility. The buildings not only met the practical needs of Bristol's merchants and manufacturers, they also declared Bristol to be a port city which stood equal to any other in the world, a nexus of global trade which looked outward as much as inward for artistic inspiration. This explanation does sound believable, however, the former history student in me is naturally sceptical of such bold claims without any documentary evidence provided in support, and naturally prone to poking holes and dreaming up counterexamples. For example, the sailors and stevedores who would see these buildings were surely not the people that the merchants and traders were trying to impress. These weren't, after all, the headquarters where clients were being entertained and deals being struck. Secondly, to what extent would those commissioning these buildings even influence the style at all, versus simply setting out their requirements and budget and then entirely deferring to the architect on aesthetic matters? Thirdly, I'm not even convinced that these styles would, at the time, have projected an image of globalised modernity. That is, that any contemporary observer would have taken these buildings as evidence that Bristol was an equal port to any in the world. In the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was famously labelled the sick man of Europe, and the Moors were never particularly renowned for seafaring or trading in the first place. So these are not necessarily obvious reference points for a port to claim modernity and prestige. In fact, despite the fact I've been cheerfully describing these influences as exotic throughout this video, these are not necessarily even particularly exotic or adventurous styles. This is, after all, an era when architectural influences were drawn from as far afield as India, and Bristol routinely traded with the New World. From this perspective, Mediterranean flavours are actually pretty old-fashioned, surely. I don't mean to dismiss the line of thinking entirely. I don't doubt that the architects were keen to show that they took inspiration from a broad range of cultures, because artists and creative types always are. But I do wonder how much of this stuff was really driven by any conscious commercial statement of intent for Bristol overall on the world stage. It feels more to me like a local fashion, with Bristol's merchants and rather small circle of architects showing off not to the world, but to each other. Whatever the rationale for choosing these styles, they continued to flourish in the first half of the 1870s. 1871 saw the completion of the City Museum and Library, the next, and indeed last, major civic commission in this story. This was a collaboration between Foster, from Foster and Wood, and Ponton, from the Granary's team of Ponton and Gough, although Historic England suggests that Foster alone handled the exterior. The original design was considerably more ambitious than it appears today. Polychromatic masonry was intended, but never happened, balconies likewise. Some of the detail which was built was lost during World War II bombing, including a sculptural cornice. So today it has a strangely minimalist take on Venetian Gothic, making it look somewhat more modern than it actually is, at least in my eyes. Still, I don't think the relative starkness of this elevation is necessarily such a bad thing, because although I've spent much of the last 10 minutes gushing about intricately decorative Victorian architecture, I'm not actually one of those kinds of people who thinks more ornamentation automatically makes for a better building, and decries anything with clean lines and raw surfaces as sterile or inhuman. On the contrary, to take a slightly perhaps controversial example, I personally much prefer the National Theatre to the Houses of Parliament. Anyway, the point being, in this instance, I don't think the building suffers from the stripping down of its ornamentation. It allows the very nice proportions, shape and rhythm of these arches space to breathe. 1872 saw the creation of Victoria Street, cutting through the medieval street pattern of Redcliffe to provide a direct route between Bristol Bridge and Temple Meads railway station, and with it came a new wave of commercial buildings. Construction of the Royal Talbot Hotel at No. 2 kicked off in 1873, with a Bristol-based architect called J. Bevan responsible. This building isn't listed at all, which rather puzzled me because it seemed to me like a charming enough building that was surely worthy of Grade 2. You could perhaps accuse this elevation of being a little mechanical, but the curved corner on the junction with Bar Street is lovely, and close examination of the detailing reveals some extremely nice touches. These zigzag bricks around the arches, and there's a double horizontal layer of them up here as well. It turns out that almost none of this is original, having been badly damaged in the Bristol Blitz of 1940. My Pevsner guide informs me that the rebuild was as late as 1994, describing it as almost undetectable, and it includes an 1870 image that I unfortunately can't reproduce here, which confirms the remarkable accuracy of the reconstruction. Next door, 4 and 6 Victoria Street is the only building for which I can find no trace of a suggestion of a possible architect at all. I'm actually a bit mystified why none of the sources tout Henry Masters as a possibility, since he has been linked with No. 8. The buildings were developed as a group at the same time, they look similar to each other, and they're also reminiscent of 35 King Street, although to be fair that was not definitively attributed to Masters either. Like 35 King Street, they have these slender red brick columns spanning multiple floors, topped off with decorated pointed arches. Here we have a new twist on the previously seen ingredients, taking the idea of alternating stone colours in the arches and mixing it with the more granular pixel art of our polychromatic brick, the result being what Historic England describe as patterned voussoirs, and what I would describe as looking a bit like Space Invaders. The ground floor frontage of No. 8 has very obviously suffered a 20th century intervention, and the cornice seems to have weathered significantly over the years, but otherwise much of these two remains delightfully intact. The depth and colour of their detailing are particularly welcome presents on an otherwise frankly bleak street, the devastation of the Blitz providing a mostly blank canvas for post-war architects, which they singularly failed to do anything interesting with. Although our not particularly Byzantine Bristol Byzantine styles were now seeming to flourish on the high street, they had not been forgotten on the wharf. 1874 saw our old friend William Bruce Gingell return to the Bathurst Basin, opposite his General Hospital, with this warehouse, which is easily my favourite of his buildings in this video. In fact, with all due respect to the man, a tiny part of me almost wants to query the attribution because it just doesn't seem very in keeping with his other work. The hospital, brewhouse and gardener's buildings all feature extremely chunky arches, lintels and so forth. Chunky almost to the point of clunky in my opinion. This one, on the other hand, seems to display an extremely light and delicate touch. Could it perhaps have been largely the work of one of his associates or juniors, uncredited? I don't know, and I don't have any evidence for even raising this doubt, besides the fact that this one looks deft and graceful and slightly whimsical to me, while his others tend to look stout and serious and perhaps a little leaden. And that, as the saying goes, is just like my opinion, man. But whether it's Gingell's work or not, it's one of my favourites in this video. I like the bright yellow shades of brick being the dominant colour. I like the fact that it has these two halves, which on the one hand clearly match with this continuous parapet and the reflected polychromatic brick along the seam, and the shared visual language such as the inlaid ogee hoods over the windows, and yet both halves are distinctly different too. We have discrete use of the three-dimensionally zigzagged bricks we've seen before, as well as this rather nice riffing on the theme where the bricks are flush to the wall but zigzagged the other way instead. The left half is also another nice example of creating verticality by grouping several floors of windows into these recessed super arches, somewhat similar to Bush House we saw right at the beginning. And for those of you on Heritage Watch, everything except this facade dates from 1981, and round the back that very much shows. The architects have chosen a similar yellow coloured brick and made a token effort to inject some red brick detailing, but to be honest it's a little bit hard to see why they even bothered. Sadly, this building seems to be more or less the last hurrah for Bristol Byzantine. I say seems to be because, of course, I didn't do anything resembling actual proper, diligent historical research, so for all I know there was a huge boom of these buildings in the late 1870s. They just all happened to have been destroyed in the meantime. But from today's perspective at least, it's probably fair to say this stands as the last truly outstanding example to be built. It wasn't the outright last. There were subsequent forays into similar territory. Back at the Christopher Thomas Soap Works, in 1881, another polychromatic brick warehouse went up next door to the offices we saw earlier. The architect did a nice job creating continuity from Foster and Wood's existing arches on the ground floor, but it's not clear who that was. Historic England unambiguously attribute this to William Bruce Gingell, but the Pevsner Guide is equally decisive in crediting a C. James. The overall building, though, is hardly iconic. The enormous Pan building behind, also from circa 1881 and also tentatively credited to C. James, is more of a landmark, but to include its Florentine crenellation and turrets as Bristol Byzantine seems to be stretching an already stretched definition. In 1883, we see this tobacco factory from H. Crisp and H.C.M. Hurst, which serves to rather summarise the fading out of Bristol Byzantine. Yes, we have an arcade of Moorishly alternating colour arches, and yes, we can tick off many other features we've seen throughout this video, pennant rubble, bathstone trimmings, and the listing asserts it to be partly Venetian Gothic in style. But it doesn't exactly radiate any Eastern or exotic flavour. In fact, with this pediment and balustrade up here, we seem to have drifted back to where we started. Plain old classical. Elsewhere, architects drifted back to generic Victorian. Essentially, it seems Bristol Byzantine simply fizzled out. And unfortunately, this video is about to do likewise. Because whereas most TV documentaries would at this point be dramatically re-emphasising how their subject changed the world, this style's long-term influence, outside Bristol, was little to none as far as I can tell. Of course, within Bristol, these buildings continue to influence the urban realm by their very existence, as any building does. And you can often see 20th century contributions attempting to respond to them, with varying degrees of commitment and success, as here on King Street, for example. But I am left struggling to even sustain the idea that my subject really exists. Bristol Byzantine is commonly defined as a design trend in Bristol's 19th century industrial buildings, but several major examples aren't industrial. Most of them are by now more accurately described as 20th century buildings with 19th century facades bolted on, and there's no real evidence that the architects believed that they were working in a single Bristol Byzantine style, as opposed to doing a bit of Venetian Gothic here, then dabbling with a bit of Moorish over there. Still, however illusory the category may be, it gave me some motivation to get out walking, photographing and researching some local history, which turns into a rather enjoyable distraction for me. If you enjoyed this video at all, then perhaps you might consider subscribing to this channel, as I hope to produce some further videos on similar stuff: architecture, urbanities, civil engineering, local history and that sort of thing, both in Bristol and hopefully further afield, as and when it's realistic to travel. So all that's left to say is special thanks to all of those photographers, map makers, chart artists, Wikipedia editors and so on, who contribute to the great reusable commons of information and images, without whom this video would not have been possible. And finally, thanks for watching.